The Shadows of Britain. 10 bizarre jobs that sound fake but were totally real. The history of Great Britain is not just a tale of majestic coronations, tea in manicured gardens, and the launch of the first steam engine. It is a story of survival in conditions that today would look like the backdrop of a horror movie or a dystopian novel. Before the arrival of automation, centralized plumbing, and electricity, British life was sustained by an army of people whose professions today evoke either nervous laughter or genuine shudders. These people were the living cogs of a massive imperial machine. They didn't just work, they fought for every penny, often risking their health and their very lives. We present to you 10 British professions of the past that sound like an absurd joke, but were the harsh reality for millions of our ancestors. 1. The knocker-upper, the living alarm clock of the industrial era. Imagine industrial Manchester or Liverpool in the 1870s. A thick smog hangs over the city, and the boilers at the factories are already beginning to hiss. At this hour, a person walks the streets whose job is to make the city wake up. Before alarm clocks were affordable for the working class, and for a long time they were expensive, fragile, and unreliable, the profession of the knocker-upper was vital. These people worked on contract. For a few pence a week, the knocker-upper promised to tap on your window at a strictly defined time. This was no mere formality. If a worker was late for their shift at a cotton mill, they could be fined a day's wages or fired on the spot. Knocker-uppers used long bamboo poles to reach the windows of the second and third floors. Some had soft hammers or bundles of wire attached to the end of the pole, so the knock was loud enough for the sleeper, but didn't wake the entire neighborhood. The most ingenious used pea shooters, firing dried peas at the window panes. This required sniper-like precision and was the quietest way to get the job done. One of the most famous figures was Mary Smith of East London, who for decades fired peas at the windows of workers to earn her bread. The profession was so in demand that in some parts of Britain it lasted until the early 1940s, until the noise of World War II air raids finally made the knocker-upper's job redundant. 2. The resurrectionist, the nighttime revivers of graves. If the knocker-upper is a symbol of order, the resurrectionist, body snatcher, is a symbol of dark progress. In the late 18th century, British medicine made a giant leap, but anatomists faced a legal dead end. By law, only the bodies of executed murderers were allowed for dissection. However, the number of executions was falling, while the number of medical students was soaring. Demand created supply. Resurrectionists were professional corpse hunters. They knew the funeral schedules at local churchyards and worked in teams. At night, they would dig up a fresh grave, usually only at the head end, slip a rope under the deceased's armpits, and literally yank them out of the coffin. To minimize the risk of prison, they always left the clothes and personal belongings in the grave. Under British law at the time, a body was not considered property, but stealing a shroud or a dress was a felony. It was dirty, but incredibly lucrative work. For a fresh body, a resurrectionist could receive between £8 and £12, more than a labourer's annual wage. The fear of them was so great that wealthy families began installing mort safes, heavy iron cages over graves, while the poor kept watch at cemeteries for weeks until the body began to decay and lost its value to the anatomists. 3. The groom of the stool, guardian of the royal latrine. Let's move from the graveyard dirt to the gilded halls of the Tudor court. The profession of groom of the stool sounds demeaning, but in reality, it was one of the most prestigious and influential positions in the state. The groom's duties were to accompany the king to the toilet, help him undress, and, most importantly, monitor the cleanliness of the process and the health of the monarch's bowel movements. Why did the sons of dukes and earls compete for this job? The answer is simple: proximity to the body. At the moments when the king was on the stool, he was at his most vulnerable and inclined to be candid. The groom was the only person who spent 20 to 30 minutes with the monarch in complete silence and privacy every day. This was a time for whispering, intrigue, and obtaining royal favors. Grooms of the stool often became personal secretaries, financial managers, and the king's most trusted confidants. Sir Henry Norris, who held the post under Henry VIII, had such influence that ministers bowed to him, hoping for a good word to be whispered to the king during the morning procedures. The profession lasted until 1901, when King Edward VII finally abolished it, deciding he could manage his own hygiene. 4. The Tosher, hunters of the London underworld. London in the mid-19th century was a city literally drowning in its own waste. Beneath the streets lay a network of old brick sewer tunnels that emptied directly into the Thames. And that is exactly where the Toshers worked. A Tosher was a person who descended into the sewers in search of valuables. They entered the tunnels during low tide through open outlets on the riverbanks. Armed with long poles with hooks and lanterns strapped to their chests, they waded through filth up to their knees, and sometimes their waists. Their goal was coins, silver spoons, scraps of copper or iron that were accidentally washed down sinks or dropped through street grates. The work was deadly. At any second, the tide could turn and the tunnel would fill with water in minutes. Furthermore, toxic gases accumulated in the sewers, and massive rats were ready to attack an injured person. Nevertheless, a skilled Tosher could find 5 to 10 shillings worth of valuables in a good shift, making them the elite among the poor. They were physically tough and possessed unique immunity, surviving where an ordinary person would have died of cholera within a week. 5. The Fuller, the human washing machine powered by urine. British wool was world famous, but the process of preparing it was far from romantic. Freshly shorn and woven wool is full of grease, lanolin, and dirt. To clean it and make it dense, the fabric had to be fulled. This is where the fuller came in. The best cleaner at the time was considered to be ammonia. In the pre-industrial era, the only available source of ammonia on an industrial scale was human urine. Fullers worked in huge wooden vats filled with fermented urine. Their job was to spend hours trampling the fabric with their feet, kicking the dirt out of it. The smell in a fuller's workshop was so pungent that they were usually banished to the very outskirts of towns. But demand was so great that special public pots were placed on London's streets, the contents of which were collected every morning for the fuller's needs. The expression, "money doesn't smell," perfectly fit this profession. Owners of fulling mills were wealthy people, despite the fact they reeked of urine from a mile away. 6. The Pure Finder, collector of canine gold. If you think your job is trash, meet the Pure Finders. The word pure was the ironic Victorian name for dog feces, and it was a strategic resource. In 19th century London, hundreds of tanneries operated in the Bermondsey district. To tan leather and make it soft and supple, a substance was needed that could neutralize lime. Dog dung, thanks to its alkaline properties, fit the bill perfectly. Collectors, often women and children, walked the streets with leather buckets. The most valuable was dry white dung. It was used for the finest leather, which went into expensive women's gloves. Collectors often got into fights over territory, certain parks, or prestigious areas where dogs were fed better, providing higher quality raw material. It was a job on the edge of poverty, but it ensured the functioning of Britain's massive leather industry. 7. The link boy, the living torch of the dark city. Before the arrival of gas lamps, London at night was a territory of darkness. Narrow alleys, open sewer grates, and gangs of robbers made any movement after sunset a game with death. The solution: the link boy. These were boys who stood outside taverns and theatres with torches, links, made of hemp soaked in resin. For a penny or a halfpenny, such a boy would run ahead of your carriage, lighting the way. But there was a dark side. Many link boys worked in league with thieves. They might lead you into a dead end, suddenly extinguish the torch, and vanish, leaving you to the mercy of bandits. Nevertheless, outside many old London houses, you can still see cast-iron cones. These were for gentlemen to snuff out their guides' torches before entering the house. 8. The crossing sweeper, guardian of the clean path. Victorian roads were covered not only in mud, but in tons of horse manure. A lady in a long silk dress could not cross the street without ruining her outfit. The crossing sweeper was a person with a broom who chose a specific intersection and cleared a small path for wealthy pedestrians. It was a form of legalized begging. If you didn't give the sweeper a coin, next time they might accidentally splash mud on your trousers or leave a pile of manure right in your path. It was a strictly hierarchical job. The best crossings near Piccadilly or Regent Street were inherited or even sold. 9. The leech collector, living bait for bloodsuckers. 19th century medicine believed in the healing power of bloodletting. Leeches were required by the millions, but how to catch them? That was the job of the leech collectors. Most often, these were poor women. The method of collection was simple and horrific. They walked into marshes barefoot and waited for leeches to attach to their legs. Then they would step onto the bank, peel off the catch, and put them in jars. Leech collectors suffered from constant blood loss, leg ulcers, and infections. By the 1850s, leeches in Britain became scarce, and collectors had to travel as far as the wilds of Scotland and Ireland to satisfy the demand of London's apothecaries. 10. The mudlark, skylarks of the filthy Thames. If you had absolutely no money, no tools, and not even shoes, you became a mudlark. These were the poorest of the poor, usually children or the elderly. During low tide on the Thames, they would go out onto the exposed riverbed. In the freezing mud, amidst broken glass and animal carcasses, they scavenged for scraps of rope, nails, coal chips, or pieces of iron dropped from ships. All of this was then sold to rag-and-bone men for pittance. The constant risk of cuts, which in those days often led to sepsis and death, and the cold made this job a short path to the grave. However, it was the mudlarks who became the ancestors of modern metal detectorists, who today find priceless artifacts from the Roman Empire in the Thames silt. These 10 professions are just the tip of the iceberg of the incredible and sometimes terrifying history of British labour. Every time your job feels boring or difficult, remember the person standing knee-deep in urine or waiting for a leech to bite their leg. We have come a long way, but it was these invisible people who built the foundation of the comfortable world we live in today. If you enjoyed this journey into the strange and forgotten history of Great Britain, please make sure to subscribe to my channel.